Now it's my pleasure to welcome Rhonda Galbally to the conference, our keynote speaker. Rhonda has focused her life's work on making a difference for a more equitable society. Rhonda has been a CEO for 23 years in business, the public sector, philanthropy and community, including the Myer Foundation and Sydney Myer Fund, the Australian Commission for the Future, the Australian International Health Institute at the University of Melbourne, which is now the Nossal Institute, and Vic Health, the world's first organisation to use a dedicated tobacco tax for health promotion, which has been her contribution to public health in over 10 years in terms of developing and sustaining Vic Health as one of the most important international strategies in tobacco control, and was recognised with an award of the World Health Organization in 1996. From 2000 to 2009, Rhonda's passionate support for community culminated in her role as founding CEO of Our Community, www.ourcommunity.com.au. Rhonda is currently Chair of the Victorian Disability Advisory Council, Chair of the National People with Disability and Carers Council, member of the independent panel advising the Productivity Commission on the need for long-term care and support scheme for people with disabilities, many of you will be aware, Chair of the Royal Women's Hospital, Chair of the International Board of Evaluation for the Thai Health Promotion Foundation, and patron of Compassionate Friends. We would like to welcome Rhonda as our keynote. As we know, she can tell us a lot about community engagement and taking it to the streets. Thank you, Rhonda.
Thank you very much, first of all, for the honour of being asked to come today to give you this keynote address. It's really an honour to be at such an opening, such a rich and interesting opening. And also, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and to their elders past and present, and thank them for having me on this land today. I think it's a very significant time, right now, on this day in Australia, for people with disabilities. And when you look where we've come from, it's most important that AGOSCI has this conference and really joins in with the movement, which I'm sure you're part of, for quite important and dramatic change in Australia. Just a brief sort of excursion to where we are today. From the 19th century, when people with disabilities were completely ignored, I guess in some ways completely integrated, because there were no provisions at all for anybody. So you just sort of made it or you didn't, usually didn't, in society, through to the 20th century, when institutions were begun. And people, I don't know who here who remembers institutions, but I remember them very well, because it was only very lucky that I wasn't put in an institution in my early childhood. There was certainly a lot of pressure on my family to put me in an institution, and if I had been institutionalised, I certainly wouldn't have been sitting here before you today. The institutions as a movement were largely parent-driven, where they really did believe that they were doing something for our children with disabilities, because prior to that nothing was done. But as it happened, they were really locked away. They were like prisons, out of sight and out of mind. And we think that we've moved past institutions, but I'll come to that, because I think some of our hopes and dreams in getting group homes going really led to mini institutions, and there's still a lot of work to do. So how did we get things changed? And I was chatting just before the conference to Darryl Selwood, who's going to be speaking to you on Saturday, and he reminded me of Ed Roberts, and he's going to tell you that story of Ed dragging himself upstairs in San Francisco to bring the issues of people with disabilities to political attention. And Ed also was part of course, the Vietnam vets who came back from the war. They'd fought a very unpopular and difficult war. They were adults. They came back profoundly disabled, completely disabled. There's a couple of movies that you might want to, some of you will have seen them. Born on the 4th of July, an Oliver Stone movie, is worth having a look at. And Coming Home is another one. So here were these adult men back from the war, being put into institutions and locked away, and they said no. And I think the Ed Roberts, who was a polio person, and the Vietnam vets all came together and they said no in a way that was really big in the United States in the late 60s. And from that time, Australia started in '75, and there were famous people who should be our heroes, you know, and their names have been forgotten. I guess one that I would like to put in front of you is Rob McNamara. People in the mid-70s in Australia, who many of whom have died since, who fought in the same way the Vietnam vets did for people to come out of institutions and for disability rights. There is a history in the disability rights movement in Australia that I think is incredibly important. So out of institutions, refusing to be objects of charity, which were very largely what the institutions were built on, demanding to live in the community, starting what was called the independent living movement, and really transformational in Australia. And then that movement in the United States went around the world. It's probably true, actually, that in other countries things were starting, but it just seemed that the United States was the first country. But Canada, Scandinavia, Netherlands, Germany, UK, and then Australia was actually later. And I often wonder if that's because we've got a sort of a fantasy about perfection, you know, from the Bondi hunk, you know, who's all bronze, and the surfer. I wonder if we have more of an investment in the perfect body in Australia, and if that was why we were so late. But by the time I came into the disability rights movement, which was in 1979, it was going strong. And it was very much about deinstitutionalisation in Australia. We knew that behind the institutional walls there was real horror going on, because all institutions breed horror. But we also knew that when people were behind the walls, they weren't out and about changing society, because being out and about is one of the best changes that can be made, because then people see people with disabilities, they're friends, they go to school, they work. So changing, being out from behind the walls is the most important way to really destroy discrimination. Being behind walls and not out in society is the way discrimination is bred, from the fear and the loathing at not being familiar. So that was why we focused on deinstitutionalisation in those days. And it was incredibly important, and we felt we had enormous wins. And one of the architects of one of the most important wins in Australia is here with us today, and that's Rosie Crossley and Chris Borthwick. Both of them, with Annie MacDonald, were extremely important in breaking down and smashing the walls of St Nicholas in Melbourne. I'm sure the same things were happening in every state of Australia, but in Melbourne this was our first really major breaking down of institutional walls. And of course it was about communication, because it was about lack of communication or the technology to facilitate communication, which Rosie then contributed to enormously in Australia. But it was about, as the opening said, no understanding, that there was understanding. And so Annie, of course, fought her case in the Supreme Court and was deemed to be able to decide to leave St Nicholas, and after that St Nicholas closed down. And I think that that's really landmark work. That's part of the history of disability rights that's about communication that we ought to honour. And I thought we might just take time to honour that now. You know, right back then in the early 80s when things really changed in Australia. So there's Rosie up there. I think we should give her a in clapping Rosie and Chris, we're also clapping Annie, who sadly died this year, but she's with us. You know, Annie McDonald is with us. And Rosie will tell you later, I hope, about this very serious situation that we're still in. Here we are 30 years later, and still Leonie, who wrote a paper with Annie to present at this very conference, was prevented from coming to give the paper, deemed not to be able to understand. So it's just an extraordinary, and you'll hear more about this terrible situation in Victoria that would be reproduced all around Australia still. And I'm going to come to Leonie when I speak to you about the reforms that we're campaigning for, because I do believe that the reforms that we're campaigning for, if we could get them, would perhaps prevent this sort of situation occurring. But it is really shocking to think that we thought we'd knocked down the walls. That's what I mean about institutions, and yet still there's institutional behaviour in our society. However, you know, still in those years, we had the onset of the Hawke Labor government, and Senator Don Grimes was very important because he brought in major reform in Australia. He broke down, you know, his reforms broke down many institutions too. People were in the streets and out and about. The self-help movement started, and there couldn't be anything more important than that movement, where people, I noticed on the DVD for the conference opening, how heartening it is to get together with others who are in the same position. And that's the self-help movement, which started at that time, where people got together not only to support each other and for mutual understanding, but to fight for rights. So it was also important in the fighting that came from the self-help groups in Australian society. You know, there was ferment, there was change, there was optimism, there was hope. Guardianship boards and offices of public advocates were established to protect rights. And honestly, we really thought we'd done it. You know, I don't know if we were naive or silly or what, but we thought we'd broken down the barriers and we'd done the work, and really things were going to now go from better to fabulous.